Hi, I'm Julieanne Kost, and in the next few minutes we're going to discover the power of masking in Adobe Camera Raw. Now, to access the masking, we can either tap the M key or we can click on the mask icon. There are a number of masks that are created by and driven by artificial intelligence and machine learning, including subject, sky, background, objects, and people. There are also a number of manual masks, including the brush, the linear gradient, and the radial gradient. We can also use range masking for color range, luminance, and depth range. I'm going to start by selecting the brush. When I do so, the masking panel appears. We can drag in order to reposition this. We can even reposition it on a second monitor, or we can dock it with all of the adjustments. For now, I'll go ahead and drag that out and reposition it in the upper right. There are a number of different brush options that we can modify. I'll use the disclosure triangle. We can change the size as well as the feather or the hardness of the brush, as well as the flow, which sets the speed at which the brush applies the adjustment. So lowering the flow amount enables a slower buildup of an adjustment, and it enables us to add different amounts of an adjustment within a single mask. The density slider is going to cap the amount of the adjustment that can be applied, even if we use multiple brush strokes with the flow set all the way to 100. Below that is the auto mask option. So auto mask detects edges based on contrast and color in order to help apply adjustments to selective areas. And we can toggle that on and off by tapping the W key. If we wanted to use keyboard shortcuts to increase or decrease the size of the brush, that would be the right or left bracket key. If we add the shift key, it will increase or decrease the feather amount. All right, I want to darken the rocks in the upper left, so I'm going to start painting, and as soon as I do, we see this red overlay. If I wanted to change the color of that overlay, we can click in the color swatch. We can select a different color as well as change the brightness and the opacity and determine whether the color indicates the affected areas or the unaffected areas. For now, I'll cancel out of there and then use the exposure slider in order to darken down those rocks. As soon as we adjust any of these sliders, we can see that the overlay automatically disappears, but I can tap the Y key in order to see it, or use the check mark in the masks panel to toggle its visibility. If I paint in an area and then I decide I don't want the adjustment to appear there, I can either switch to the eraser tool, which has its own sets of attributes, or we can stay with the brush tool and then just temporarily access the eraser by holding down the Option key. Then I'll paint over that area in order to remove it from the adjusted area. All right, I'll tap Y in order to hide the overlay. And I also need to darken down this rock here, but it doesn't need as much of an adjustment. So I'm going to decrease the flow, get a little bit smaller of a brush using the left bracket key, and then paint over the area multiple times to slowly build up the adjustment that I want. In addition to seeing a color overlay, there are a number of other ways that we can look at our masks. We can either select them from the list here, or I can add the Shift key and tap the Y key in order to toggle down through the list. This option for white on black is the one that I prefer because I think it's easiest to see the areas that are going to be affected versus those that aren't. So here where the mask is white, we will see the adjustment at 100%, and then we can see where I painted with a lower flow, this area is a darker gray, it's not as white, so we're going to see a reduced amount of the adjustment in this area, and then that's going to slowly fade through the darker values all the way to black where the adjustment will be hidden. All right, let's set that back to color and then toggle it off. If I ever wanted to invert this mask, I can click on the invert icon here, or we can tap the X key to automatically invert the mask. Now, in order to rename a mask, I can use the More icon next to the mask, or I can simply double click on it and then type in the name in order to rename it. We can click the eye icon to toggle the visibility of the mask or of the mask component. Now, this mask only has one mask component, so right now I'm seeing the same thing, but in a moment we'll see the advantage of adding multiple components. There are additional options using the More icon. We can invert the mask, duplicate and invert the mask, intersect the mask with additional components, which we'll look at in a minute, duplicate, hide, delete, or reset the mask or the component, as well as delete all masks. We can also delete all of our masks by simply clicking on the reset icon. All right, let's click the plus icon in order to add a second mask. I'll choose the brush again. And you'll notice that if I scroll down, by default, all of the adjustments are reset automatically. If you wanted to toggle off that behavior, you could uncheck the option. And I'm going to increase the flow as well as the feather, and then use the right bracket key in order to get a larger brush size, and then paint down here in the water area so that I can decrease the exposure, as well as add some clarity and some dehaze. Now dehaze typically also adds some saturation, so I'm going to decrease that saturation and increase the noise reduction because dehaze tends to amplify that as well. Now that I've adjusted several different sliders, if I just want to increase or decrease the amount of the overall adjustment, I can use the amount slider to either lessen or amplify it. All right, let's add a third mask. Again, I'm going to select the brush, but I'm going to decrease the flow as well as the size, and then paint down in this area just to darken it down. I'm going to paint a little less over here because it needs less of an adjustment, and then I'll decrease the exposure as well as the highlights and the whites, and then decrease the temperature to add a little bit of a blue as well as the tint. If I want to reposition a pin, I can select it and then drag to reposition. I'll use Command Z in order to undo that. It might not make sense in this image, but if I had a number of similar images where I'm copying and pasting masks between them, it might be handy if what I'm masking has moved between images. Now by default, only the targeted masks pins are visible, but we can use the More icon in order to show the unselected mask pins. And that can be really handy because, for example, now I can see this pin in the upper left. If I position my cursor on top of it, it will show me the overlay for that pin. And instead of having to find that mask in the mask panel, especially if I haven't named all of my masks, I can just click on that pin in order to select it. If I have a lot of masking pins and I want to hide them, I can tap the V key in order to temporarily hide and display them. All right, let's use the eye icon in the upper right to toggle the visibility of all the masks. So there's before and there's after. All right, I'll use the / key in order to display the film strip and then select the second image of the birch tree. Here I want to start with a linear gradient, so I'll select that. And then I want to lighten the left side of the image, so I'll click and drag over to the right. Here we see the area that's going to be affected with the red overlay. I can lengthen or decrease the size of the fade range by clicking on either one of the outer lines. I can reposition this in the image area, and I can click and drag to rotate either using that center line or by using this little handle right here. If I ever need to invert it, I can either tap the X key or we can click on the icon in the Adjustments panel. To quickly make some tonal as well as color adjustments, I'm going to scroll down and use the Curve option. Here I want to increase my shadows, so I'll drag up on the curve and then click to add another point so that my highlights don't go too far. Then in order to add some yellow, I'll click on the blue channel and drag that down. And to add some red, I'll click the red channel and drag that up. Now, while I like how this linear gradient is affecting the left side of the image, I don't like the way that it's affecting the birch tree. So I'm going to add a secondary component. I want to subtract this area from the linear gradient, so I'll choose Subtract and then select the brush. I'll set the flow all the way to 100, decrease the feather amount a bit, and then use the right bracket to get a little larger of a brush, and then I'm going to paint in the areas that I don't want to be affected by that linear gradient. So I'm subtracting all of these areas from that initial mask. Now if I position my cursor on top of the linear gradient, we can see the overlay for the linear gradient. We can also see the brush that I'm subtracting. And if I hover my cursor over the thumbnails for the mask, now we see the result of those components being combined together. One huge benefit of having each of these components separate is that I can select any of them at any time and I can reposition them, I could rotate it, I could resize it, I can make as many changes to the linear gradient and it doesn't affect the brush mask that I'm subtracting from it. Now later when we're using some of the AI masks, we can't change the location of those masks because they're automatically calculated for us, but we can always change any manual masks. All right, if I wanted to delete just a single mask component, I would click on the More icon next to that component, and then I can delete it. If I wanted to delete the entire mask, I would click the More icon next to the mask. All right, let's move to this next image. And here I want to add a radial gradient. I'll use Command minus on Mac, Control minus on Windows in order to zoom out once, and then I'll click and drag out my radial gradient. I can change the shape of the radial gradient by clicking on any of these dots. We can also rotate the radial gradient. I can reposition it, but when I decrease the exposure, we can see that it's the inside of the gradient that's being affected, and I want the opposite. So I can either tap the X key or we can click on the icon to invert the gradient. I can also change the feather amount from a hard edge to a very soft edge. If I want to, I can drag this out to extend beyond the image canvas, which might be necessary just depending on the shape that you're trying to create. All right, let's cool the color temperature by moving it more towards blue. And while I like what's happening in the background, I've hidden some of the yellow in the foreground. So I'll add a second component by choosing Subtract and then Linear Gradient. Then I can click and drag up into the image, hiding that radial gradient from the lower left area. Now just because I've used one mask to hide it, I want to show you that I can also add that information back in. I'll choose Add, select the brush, increase the feather but decrease the flow, and then start painting in the lower right to just add back in a little bit of that adjustment in the areas that I want it. So now we have the original radial gradient, we're subtracting the linear gradient, adding back in the brush, and here's the resulting composite mask. Again, we can use the eye to toggle off and on all of the masks. All right, let's move to this image of the pears and take a look at some of these masks that are created by artificial intelligence and machine learning. I'm going to start with subject. Camera Raw will automatically select the subject in the photograph, and in this case, I just want to increase the color temperature. If I wanted to select the background, I can click on the plus icon and then choose Select Background, which is the same as the inverse of the subject. Now, I don't need that right now, so let's delete Mask 2. And I only want to select this middle pair. So I'll choose the plus icon and then select Objects. This tool has two modes. You can scribble loosely over an object to select it, or we can use this rectangle select. Now all I need to do is drag out the rectangular marquee, and when I release the cursor, Camera Raw will shrink wrap that to the object. Here I want to change the hue. If I want to toggle on the Use Fine Adjustments, I can enable it, or just hold down the Option key to temporarily enable it. All right, let's move that a little bit more towards orange. But we can see that the stem is also being affected, so I'll choose Subtract, select the brush, increase the flow but decrease the feather, and then remove that adjustment from the stem. Now I'd like to experiment with removing some of the color from this area, so instead of continuing with this mask, because I'm not sure if I'll like it, I'm going to add another Subtract mask using the brush again, but this time adding a large feather and decreasing the flow. I'll get a little bit larger of a brush size, and then I can start painting in order to slowly subtract different areas. So now if we toggle the visibility of the object selection, subtracting the stem, and subtracting a portion of the pear, this is the final mask. I'll use the icon to just show a before and after. All right, to decrease the highlights in the napkin, I'll add a second object's mask. Again, I'll drag over the object and Camera Raw will help me to select it. Then I can take down the highlights and decrease the saturation to remove the blue tint. Then I'll zoom out. I want to add a ray of light across the background. So I'll return to the plus icon, select the brush, increase the flow, and then I'm going to click once in the upper left. Then I'll increase the size of the brush, hold down the Shift key and click again, and Camera Raw will not only connect those two dots, but also interpolate the brush size over the length of the stroke. Then I'll use the exposure slider in order to increase the exposure, but we can see that it's also affecting the pears in the foreground. So I'll subtract the subject, but it's still affecting the wood, so I'll subtract, select the brush, decrease the feather, and then paint in order to remove the effect in this area. And of course, because each of these components are independent of one another, I can always reposition this ray of light without affecting the other masks. All right, let's see a quick before and after. All right, I'm going to move to this next image and let's take a look at the sky mask. I'll select it and I'm going to decrease the exposure as well as increase the texture, clarity, and dehaze. Then I'll decrease the saturation, and in order to quickly select everything that is not sky, I'll click the three dots and choose to duplicate and invert the mask. Then I'll increase the temperature as well as the shadows and the blacks to make the foreground a little bit softer. Excellent. When we're working with photographs that have people in them, Camera Raw can automatically detect the people. And for every person that's detected, you'll see an icon right over here. In order to select a person, just click on the icon, and you can make a mask for the entire person or for individual attributes. If we wanted to combine two attributes, we could do that and create a single mask. But in this case, I'm going to select all of the attributes and create 8 separate masks. I'll choose Create, and let's start with the face skin. Here I want to remove a little bit of texture, so I'll move that to the left. And I'm going to do the same with the body skin. In this case, it's the neck. But what's nice about having them be separate masks is that I can also decrease the exposure of this to darken down the skin tone here and keep the emphasis on the face. There's a mask for eyebrows. We can go ahead and zoom in just so we can see this a little better, where we could decrease or increase the exposure. Or if we don't want a mask, we can use the 3 dots in order to delete just this mask. We have a mask for eye sclera or the whites of the eyes. I'll increase the exposure a little bit, then move to the iris and pupil, where I'll increase dehaze to darken down those shadow areas, and then add a little bit of exposure to add contrast. And the nice thing about the iris and pupil as well as the eye sclera is that they can help make a person look a little bit more alert. I'll select the lips mask and then change the temperature, select the teeth and decrease the saturation and increase the exposure, and then zoom out and select the hair mask. I'll increase the exposure and decrease the saturation. But in this case, I think some of the areas are getting a little too bright, so I'll subtract using the brush with a decreased flow in the areas that I think are too bright. I can use the V key in order to hide the pins, and we can see a quick before and after. All right, next, let's take a minute to look at range masking. With this image, I want to start with the color range masking, but I want to show how to create this mask in 2 different ways because I think it just depends on how you think as to which one you'll find easier. If we start with color range, I can click anywhere in the image to select a color range. Now the overlay is the same color, so I will click in there and then just turn this green just so that we can see it. So this is the area that is selected. Now if I want to add to my selection, I can hold down the Shift key and add up to 5 color samplers. Or we can simply click and drag in the image in order to select a color range. I'll use the hue option in order to change the hue of those reds that I've targeted. We can also refine the color range by using the Refine slider. Moving it to the left is going to tighten the color range, so fewer colors will be targeted. If I move it to the right, more colors will be included. However, this is a very similar result as if I were using the Hue, Saturation, and Luminosity panel instead of the masking. But the benefit here is that then I can combine this mask with another component. So if I only want to change the red within this sign, I can select Subtract and then Brush. I'll decrease the feather but increase the flow. And then anywhere I paint, I will remove the adjustment from the reds in the image. I'll get a little bit larger of a brush and we can remove it from here as well. So that's one way to create this mask that selects a color range but then limits what's adjusted to a specific area. Now the other way that we can do this, and I'll just toggle the visibility of this mask off for a moment, is by creating a new brush and then painting over the area that we want to affect. In this case, it'll just be the red in this sign. But you'll notice that I've also selected some of the background as well as the text area. If I want to limit my adjustment to only affect the reds, well, I can't use Add and I can't use Subtract. Instead, I'll use the More icon and I'll choose to intersect this with the color range. Then I'll click and drag to sample the red color, so within my original brushstroke, only the reds are going to be adjusted, creating this mask. Again, I'll change the hue so we can see it's only that area that's being affected. All right, let's move to this image to take a look at the luminance masking. So you'd use a luminance range mask to target areas within an image based on their brightness values. I'll tap the E key to select the edit stack, and let's zoom in this area. I want to increase the shadows in this image, but when I do so, I'm adding a lot of noise to those shadow areas. But if I add noise reduction globally, it's going to make the top of the mud look too smooth. So I'll return to masking, choose the luminance range mask. It will automatically give me an eyedropper and I can click in the darker values of the image. Let me change the overlay back to red and enable the Show Luminance Map option. Now, wherever the map is red, those are the areas that are going to be completely affected, and they fall within this rectangle. If I want to include more values, then I just need to use the tab in order to extend that rectangle. Then between the edge of the rectangle and this line, which is controlled by this slider, is the fade range. So as I separate it from the areas that are fully adjusted, I'll get a smoother transitional area. If I move it really close, then we might be able to see an abrupt transition between the areas that are adjusted and those that aren't. But of course, it's not limited to my shadows. If I move this over to the midtones, now my midtones would be affected. Or if I move it all the way over, now it's my highlights. And I would drag the fade range out from the other side. All right, I'll use the eyedropper again and click and drag in the image area in order to select the values that I want to affect. And then I'll toggle off the luminance map. But you should know if you hold down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows and you drag anywhere within this slider, you can temporarily preview the luminance map. All right, let me scroll down here and I want to increase the amount of noise reduction, so I'll scoot that over to the right. While I can see the amount of noise being reduced in the very darkest areas, I'm not seeing it right here. So I'm going to use the tab in order to increase the size of the rectangle until these areas are affected. Now if I toggle the visibility of the mask, we can see before and after. I'll zoom in once more just to make sure that we can see that. Again, there's before and there's after. I think I need a little bit larger of a fade range, so I'll pull that over. And one more time, before, and after. Excellent. Let's select this next image of the bird of paradise, and we'll take a look at depth range masking. So depth range masks select areas in an image based on their distance from the camera, and they're available to photos that have embedded depth map data. So for now, this is limited to HEIC files captured on Apple iPhones using the portrait mode. Here I also automatically get an eyedropper, and if I click on the bird of paradise, which is closest to the camera, that's the area that's going to be affected. We can toggle on the depth map using this icon right here, or similar to the luminance range masking, we can hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows as we move any of these sliders in order to see it. Let's make a change to the saturation. I'm going to decrease it. And we can see where the rectangle is on the left side. That represents the areas closest to the camera. As I start moving this to the right, we'll see the desaturated areas in the leaves. And if I go even further, then we see it in the very background here. All right, to remove the color from all of the leaves, I'll drag out the tab here. And then to make sure that there's a soft transition, I'll add the fade range. All right, let's see a quick before and after. All right, before we wrap up, I want to show 3 ways to help speed up the editing workflow. Now, if I return to this image here and then hold down the Command key on Mac, Control key on Windows in order to select multiple images, then any of the changes that I make to one image will also be made to the other, and this includes masking. I'll click the plus icon in order to create a new select background mask, and then increase the exposure in the background, and we can see that it's been increased for both of those images. Not only that, but because the mask was based on AI and ML, the masks were actually calculated independently for each image. Another way to quickly apply settings from one image to another is to select the first image, and then you could move to the next image and choose to apply previous settings, but that applies all the previous settings, which doesn't give you a lot of control. So instead, I would choose to copy the selected edit settings, and in this case, I only want to copy the masks, so I'll check none, and then enable masking, choose copy, then move to the next image, and return to the More icon, or simply use Command V on Mac, Control V on Windows to paste the edit settings. Because this image already had a mask, I have the option to either replace or merge. In this case, I'll merge them. I'll tap the V key to hide all the pins, but we can see that all of the AI masks have been re-rendered for this image. Now in this image, it couldn't find any teeth, so it shows me a warning, and to quickly delete it, I'll choose delete. One word of caution: if we remember, in this mask, not only does it have the AI mask for the hair, but also this brush mask. Now, with these two images, I didn't move much in between them, but you still might want to check that brush mask and make sure that it's in the correct location. If it's not, you could select that brush and then reposition it, or redo it all together. Finally, I want to mention that presets can also include masks. In fact, there are a number of presets that ship by default that include the AI masks, and they're considered adaptive presets. So we have adaptive portrait, sky, and subject presets. Here, if I hover over the skies, we can see that Camera Raw has detected a sky in this image and is applying the changes in the preset. Now to create my own preset, I'll choose the sky mask, decrease the exposure, add some texture, some clarity, and dehaze, and then decrease the saturation. In the presets panel, I'll add a new preset, give it a name, and then save it into a group. In this instance, selecting only the mask as my adjustment, but also including support for the amount slider. By including that support, when I move to another image and then apply my preset, I'm able to either tone down or amplify the effects. So as you can see, the power of masking in Camera Raw is incredible. I'm Julieanne Kost. Thanks for watching.